Era Mitchell never believed in fairy tales until she found herself standing outside a rusted cage in the mountains of Colorado, wearing her grandmother's wedding dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked along the trail. The man inside the cage wasn't Prince Charming. He was covered in dirt, his hair wild and unkempt, his eyes holding secrets darker than the mountain shadows. But when their eyes met through the iron bars, something shifted in the universe. This wasn't supposed to be her story. She was supposed to be walking down the aisle to marry Richard Blackwood, the successful businessman who had everything planned out perfectly. Instead, she was about to ask a stranger, a man the locals whispered about, a man who chose to live locked away from the world, to marry her instead. What happens when desperation meets mystery? When a runaway bride encounters a man who's running from something entirely different. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most extraordinary love stories. This is the tale of two souls who thought they knew their destinies, only to discover that fate had been waiting for them to find each other in the most impossible place. The mountain holds its breath. The cage door stands between them. And Sarah Mitchell is about to ask the question that will change both their lives forever. Will you marry me, please? Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror of the bridal suite at the Riverside Country Club. The woman looking back at her wore a dress that cost more than most people's cars, layers of silk and lace that her future mother-in-law had chosen, claiming it was absolutely perfect for a Blackwood wedding. Everything about this day had been chosen for her, planned around her, decided without her real input. Even the flowers in her bouquet were roses that made her sneeze, selected because they matched the color scheme that the wedding planner insisted was sophisticated and timeless. She touched the pearl necklace at her throat, another family heirloom from Richard's side. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle to marry Richard Blackwood III, heir to a real estate empire, a man who had proposed to her in a restaurant so expensive that she'd been afraid to order anything substantial. He'd presented the ring, a massive diamond that felt heavy on her finger, between the appetizer and the main course, as if marriage were just another business transaction to be completed efficiently. The door burst open behind her, and her maid of honor, Jessica, rushed in with her arms full of last-minute details. "Sarah, honey, your mother wants to know if you've decided about the veil. The photographer is getting antsy, and the florist needs to know about the altar arrangements, and, oh God, Richard's cousin just threw up on his tuxedo. So we're dealing with that situation." Sarah watched Jessica's reflection in the mirror, noting how her best friend since college seemed more stressed about this wedding than Sarah felt. That should have been her first warning sign. A bride should be nervous, excited, overwhelmed with joy, not sitting calmly while everyone around her panicked about details that felt increasingly meaningless. "Jess," Sarah said quietly, "do you remember when we were kids, and we used to play dress-up in your grandmother's attic?" Jessica paused in her frantic organization of bobby pins and lipstick. "Of course. You always insisted on being the princess who rescued herself." "What? I keep thinking about that. About the stories we used to tell where the princess didn't need saving, where she went on adventures instead of waiting in towers." Sarah turned away from the mirror to face her friend. "When did I stop being that girl?" "Sarah, what are you talking about? You're about to marry an amazing guy who loves you, who can give you everything you've ever wanted. This is your happy ending." But that was just it. Sarah couldn't remember ever wanting this particular ending. She'd wanted adventure, travel, maybe a small cabin in the mountains where she could write the novel she'd been putting off for years. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been quietly replaced by Richard's plans for their future. The house in the right neighborhood, the country club membership, the carefully scheduled children who would attend the best private schools. She stood up abruptly, the layers of her dress rustling like whispers of discontent. Through the window of the bridal suite, she could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks touched with snow even in late spring. She'd grown up in Colorado but had barely explored beyond the city limits in recent years. Richard preferred vacations to tropical resorts with 5-star ratings and reliable Wi-Fi. "I need some air," she announced, moving toward the window. "Sarah, we don't have time for air. The photographer wants pictures in 20 minutes, and your mother is already having a breakdown about the seating arrangements because Richard's Uncle Harold brought a date nobody knew about." Sarah unlatched the window and pushed it open, breathing in the cool mountain air that carried scents of pine and possibility. Somewhere out there, beyond the manicured gardens of the country club, beyond the suburbs with their identical houses, the wilderness waited. She thought about the hiking boots she'd donated to charity last year when Richard mentioned they took up too much space in their shared closet. "Jessica," she said without turning around, "what if I told you I wasn't sure about this?" The silence behind her stretched so long that Sarah finally turned to see Jessica standing frozen, a makeup brush in one hand and a look of pure panic on her face. "Not sure about what? The dress? The flowers?" "Because it's a little late to change the flowers, but we could probably, about all of it. About Richard. About this life I'm about to sign up for." Jessica sank into the velvet chair beside the mirror. "Sarah, you're having wedding jitters. It's completely normal. Everyone gets nervous before their wedding. My cousin Jenny threw up 3 times before walking down the aisle. And she's been happily married for 8 years. Did Jenny love the man she was marrying? Of course she did. Sarah, you love Richard." But, as Sarah tried to remember the last time her heart had raced when Richard entered a room, or when she'd felt genuine excitement about spending time with him, she came up empty. They got along well enough. They rarely fought because Richard made most of the decisions, and Sarah had gotten used to going along with them. Their relationship felt comfortable, predictable, safe. All words that should describe a good marriage, but somehow made Sarah feel like she was slowly suffocating. "I need to take a walk," Sarah announced, gathering up the front of her dress. "You can't take a walk. You're in a wedding dress. People will see you, it's bad luck, and, besides, we have the timeline to consider." But Sarah was already moving toward the door. In the hallway outside the bridal suite, the controlled chaos of wedding preparations swirled around her. Caterers rushed past with trays of appetizers. The string quartet was tuning their instruments in the garden. And she could hear her mother's voice carrying from somewhere near the altar, probably giving the poor wedding coordinator a detailed explanation of how the processional should proceed. She slipped out a side door and found herself on a stone terrace overlooking the parking area. Her car. Well, technically Richard's car that he'd given her, because he said the one she'd been driving wasn't appropriate for someone in her position, sat in the lot below. The keys were probably in her purse back in the bridal suite, along with her phone and her entire previous life. That's when she saw him, an old man loading camping gear into a beat-up truck. He had the weathered look of someone who spent his time outdoors, and something about his calm presence in the midst of all this wedding madness made her feel oddly peaceful. Without quite knowing why, Sarah gathered her dress and walked down to the parking lot. The man looked up as she approached, his eyes taking in her elaborate gown without judgment or surprise. "You look like someone with a story," he said simply. "I feel like someone who's lost her story," Sarah replied, surprised by her own honesty with a stranger. Mountains got a way of helping people find things they've lost, or finding things they didn't know they were looking for. He gestured toward the peaks visible beyond the country club's manicured grounds. "I used to hike," Sarah said, looking down at her silk shoes. "Before I got engaged, before my life became about matching napkins to centerpieces and choosing between salmon and chicken for 200 guests. Still mountains up there," the old man said. "Still trails. Some of them lead to places most folks never see." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight feeling she'd been carrying for months. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about a man who lived up in the mountains. She said he built a cage for himself up there, that people could visit him if they knew where to look." The old man's eyes sharpened with interest. "Ezra's place. Most folks think it's just a legend these days. Ezra built himself that cage about 15 years ago. Some say he was running from something. Others say he was running toward something. Either way, he's been up there ever since, living on his own terms." The man closed the tailgate of his truck and studied Sarah's face. "Trail starts about 10 miles north of here, follows Willow Creek up into the high country. It's a hard hike, especially in wedding dress." Sarah looked back toward the country club, where she could see people moving around the gardens, setting up for a wedding that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her wedding dress, her expensive shoes, her carefully planned future, none of it felt like her anymore. "How hard?" she asked. The old man grinned. "Hard enough to change your life, if you let it." Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah was walking back toward the building. But instead of returning to the bridal suite, she headed for the coat check where guests had left jackets and bags. She found a backpack that someone had brought, probably planning to change and go hiking after the wedding reception. She also found a pair of sneakers that looked close to her size. In the women's restroom, she changed out of her silk shoes and into the sneakers, then used the backpack to carry water bottles from the catering station. The wedding dress would have to stay. There was no changing out of it without help, and besides, something about wearing it on this journey felt right, like she was taking the symbol of one life and transforming it into something entirely different. The old man was still there when she returned to the parking lot, and he nodded approvingly at her makeshift hiking gear. "Road maps in my glove compartment," he said, tossing her his keys. "Take the truck. I'll catch a ride with someone else." "I can't take your truck." "You can and you will. Sometimes the mountain calls, and when it does, you don't make it wait while you figure out logistics." He started walking toward the building, then called back over his shoulder, "Tell Ezra that Charlie sent you. And remember, sometimes the most important conversations happen with people in cages." Sarah stood beside the truck for a long moment, keys heavy in her hand. Behind her, she could hear the string quartet starting their warm-up, the sound of her future as Mrs. Richard Blackwood III beginning without her. Ahead of her lay a mountain road that led to uncertainty, adventure, and a man in a cage who might hold answers to questions she was just beginning to ask. She started the truck and drove toward the mountains, her wedding dress spread across the passenger seat like a silk map to a destination she'd never planned to visit. In the rearview mirror, the country club grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a curve in the road that led toward the wilderness and whatever waited for her there. The mountain air flowing through the open windows carried the scent of pine and possibility, and for the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell felt like she could breathe. The gravel road wound higher into the mountains than Sarah had expected, switchbacking through stands of aspen and pine that grew thicker and wilder with each mile. Charlie's truck handled the rough terrain better than Richard's luxury sedan would have, though she couldn't help imagining his horror at the thought of his pristine vehicle navigating these washboard ruts and rocky passages. She'd been driving for almost an hour when she found the trailhead Charlie had described, marked by nothing more than a weathered wooden sign that read Willow Creek Trail in faded letters. The parking area was empty except for a few scattered pine cones and the remnants of a campfire that looked weeks old. Sarah sat in the truck for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to process the magnitude of what she was doing. By now, the wedding party would have discovered her absence. Jessica was probably in full panic mode. Her mother would be alternating between fury and tears, and Richard. She couldn't quite picture Richard's reaction. Disappointment, certainly. Embarrassment at having to explain to 200 guests why his bride had vanished. But heartbreak? She wasn't sure he was capable of feeling anything that intensely about her, just as she'd realized she wasn't capable of feeling anything that intensely about him. The wedding dress rustled as she climbed out of the truck, and she immediately understood why people didn't typically hike in formal wear. The dress had seemed manageable in the country club's climate-controlled environment, but here in the wild it felt like she was dragging half the civilized world behind her with every step. She pulled the backpack from the passenger seat and shouldered it, then looked up at the trail that disappeared into the forest ahead. According to Charlie, it was about a 5-mile hike to reach Ezra's place, following Willow Creek up through increasingly rough terrain. She'd done plenty of hiking in college, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and she'd certainly never attempted it in a dress that probably cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding. The first mile wasn't too bad. The trail followed the creek closely, winding through a corridor of aspen trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the mountain breeze. The wedding dress proved more adaptable than she'd expected. The full skirt actually helped maintain her modesty as she clambered over fallen logs and rocky sections of trail, though she had to gather the fabric in her hands to keep from tripping over the hem. But as the trail began to climb more steeply, following the creek up through a series of small waterfalls and rocky pools, Sarah began to understand why Charlie had warned her about the difficulty. Her sneakers, while better than silk wedding shoes, weren't designed for serious hiking. The backpack, loaded with water bottles and a few granola bars she'd grabbed from the catering table, felt heavier with each step. Still, she pressed on. Something about the physical challenge felt right, as if her body had been waiting for this kind of exertion after months of wedding planning that had consisted mainly of sitting in chairs and making decisions about things she didn't really care about. Her muscles remembered the rhythm of hiking, the way to pace herself for the long haul, how to read the terrain ahead, and choose the best path through obstacles. The second mile brought her into denser forest, where the creek tumbled through boulder fields and the trail became less distinct. More than once, she had to stop and search for the faint markers that indicated the correct path, small cairns of stacked stones or pieces of flagging tape tied to tree branches. The wedding dress collected burrs and pine needles, transforming from pristine white to something wilder and more practical. It was during one of these pauses, while she stood on a large granite boulder trying to spot the continuation of the trail, that she heard voices coming up the path behind her. "I'm telling you, this is crazy," a man's voice carried through the trees. "She couldn't have come this way. She's in a wedding dress, for crying out loud." Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the voice of Richard's brother Marcus, followed by the deeper tones of Richard himself. The old man at the country club said he saw her heading north. "This is the only trail that makes sense." Richard sounded more irritated than worried, which somehow didn't surprise her. "We need to find her and get back before the guests start leaving. Do you have any idea how much this wedding cost?" Sarah gathered her dress and scrambled off the boulder, looking for somewhere to hide. The forest offered plenty of options, but the white dress made camouflage nearly impossible. She settled for crouching behind a cluster of young pine trees, hoping the shadows would conceal her. Maybe she just needed some air, Marcus suggested as the voices grew closer. "You know how women get before weddings. Mom was a wreck before she married Dad. Sarah doesn't get emotional like that. She's practical, sensible. That's why I chose her." The casual way Richard said, "chose her," as if she were a car he'd selected from a lot rather than a woman he'd fallen in love with, made Sarah's stomach twist. Had he ever actually said he loved her? She tried to remember, but realized that most of his declarations about their relationship focused on how well-suited they were, how their families would blend nicely, how their combined resources would position them perfectly for the kind of life he'd always planned to live. "Richard, man, I have to ask, do you actually love her?" There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of boots on gravel and the distant murmur of the creek. "Love is for teenagers and romance novels," Richard finally replied. "Sarah and I have something better: compatibility, shared goals, mutual respect. We want the same things out of life." But that was just it, Sarah realized as she crouched behind the pine trees with her designer dress hiked up to her knees. They didn't want the same things. Richard wanted those things for both of them, and she'd simply gone along with his assumptions because it had seemed easier than figuring out what she actually wanted for herself. "Besides," Richard continued, "she'll get over whatever this is. Women have these dramatic moments sometimes. Once we get her back and get through the ceremony, everything will settle down. She'll realize she was being silly." Sarah felt a flash of anger so pure and clean that it surprised her. Silly? Her growing realization that she'd been sleepwalking through her own life was silly? Her desperate need to breathe, to think, to figure out who she was beneath all the expectations others had placed on her. That was just a dramatic moment? She waited until their voices faded up the trail before emerging from her hiding place. But instead of turning back toward the truck, as she'd briefly considered, she found herself more determined than ever to reach Ezra's place. If Richard thought her need for autonomy was silly, then he clearly didn't know her at all, which meant she'd been right to run. The third mile tested her resolve. The trail grew steeper and rockier, following the creek up through a series of switchbacks that left her breathing hard and grateful for every rest stop. The wedding dress, while still functioning as hiking attire, was beginning to show serious signs of wear. The hem was muddy and torn in several places. One of the delicate cap sleeves had caught on a branch and separated partially from the bodice, and the elaborate beadwork had lost several crystals to the rough trail. But somehow, the gradual destruction of the dress felt liberating rather than tragic. Each tear and stain marked a step further away from the life that had been planned for her, and towards something unknown but entirely her own. She stopped to rest beside a small waterfall, drinking water from the creek and eating one of the granola bars. The forest around her was alive with bird song and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. A chipmunk watched her from a nearby log, apparently fascinated by the sight of a woman in formal or taking a snack break in its territory. "What do you think?" she asked the chipmunk. "Am I completely crazy?" The chipmunk chittered what sounded like encouragement before scampering away through the trees. By the 4th mile, Sarah was operating on pure determination. Her feet hurt, her legs ached, and she was pretty sure she'd never be able to get all the pine pitch out of the dress fabric. But something had awakened in her during this climb, a sense of strength and capability she'd forgotten she possessed. Every step took her further from the woman who had stood passively in the bridal suite that morning, letting others make decisions about her life. The trail leveled out as she approached what Charlie had described as the final approach to Ezra's place. Here, the creek widened into a series of beaver ponds, and the forest opened up to reveal mountain meadows dotted with wildflowers. The setting was so beautiful it took her breath away, or maybe that was just the altitude and the exertion catching up with her. She followed a fainter path around the edge of the largest pond, where she could see the cone-shaped lodges the beavers had built and occasionally catch a glimpse of one of the industrious creatures swimming across the still water. The dress, which had started the day as a symbol of traditional femininity and dependence, now felt like battle armor she'd earned through her own effort and determination. It was as she rounded the final bend in the trail, emerging into a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, that she saw it, the cage Charlie had told her about. It wasn't what she'd expected. Instead of the primitive prison her imagination had conjured, she found herself looking at an elegant structure of wrought iron and wood, more like an outdoor room than a jail cell. It was perhaps 12 feet square, with walls of decorative ironwork that reached about 8 feet high, topped by a roof of metal and glass that would let in light while providing shelter from the weather. Inside the cage, she could see the signs of long habitation: a simple bed, bookshelves lined with volumes, a small wood stove, a table where someone had been writing. And sitting at that table, looking up at her with eyes the color of storm clouds, was the man she'd come to find. Ezra was nothing like she'd expected either. Instead of the wild hermit her imagination had created, she found herself facing a man who looked to be in his late 30s, with dark hair that was longer than fashionable but clean and well-kept, and features that spoke of both intelligence and deep sadness. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt, and his hands, she noticed as he set down his pen, showed the calluses of someone who worked with his hands, but also the ink stains of someone who wrote regularly. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the torn and muddy wedding dress, the hiking backpack, her flushed face, and determination-bright eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and gentler than she'd expected. "Well," he said, "you're either the most dedicated bride in Colorado or the most lost hiker I've ever seen." Sarah found herself laughing, a sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest where hope and relief and exhaustion had been building pressure for hours. "I'm not sure there's much difference," she replied, setting down her backpack and trying to catch her breath. "Charlie sent me. He said you might be able to help someone who's lost their story." Ezra's expression shifted, becoming more serious, but also more interested. "Charlie's a good judge of character. But I have to ask, what brings a bride in full regalia to a man in a cage in the middle of nowhere?" Sarah looked at the iron bars that separated them, at this man who had chosen isolation over whatever life he'd left behind, and realized she was about to ask the most important question of her life to a complete stranger. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "And I know it's going to sound completely crazy." Ezra leaned back in his chair, his storm gray eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass roof of his cage, casting intricate shadows of the iron framework across the simple furnishings inside. A gentle breeze moved through the mountain clearing, rustling the pages of the book he'd been reading when she arrived. "Crazy is relative up here," he said with what might have been the ghost of a smile. I've been living in a cage by choice for 15 years. Your definition of crazy and mine might be very different things. Sarah felt her heart hammering against the bodice of her dress, which suddenly seemed far too tight despite all the alterations. She'd practiced speeches for presentations at work, had rehearsed conversations with Richard about future plans, but she'd never prepared for this moment. Standing in a mountain clearing in a torn wedding dress, about to ask a caged stranger to marry her. I was supposed to get married today, she began, then immediately felt foolish. The dress made that fairly obvious. To a man named Richard Blackwood. Good family, successful business, everything planned out perfectly. But you're here instead. I'm here instead. She took a deep breath, drawing in the scent of pine and wildflowers and something indefinable that might have been freedom. I realized this morning that I was about to marry a life rather than a person, that I was becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who doesn't dream or take risks or ask difficult questions. Ezra nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. And what does that have to do with me? I've been thinking about fairy tales, about the stories we tell ourselves about how life is supposed to work. Sarah moved closer to the cage, close enough to see the titles of some of the books on his shelves: philosophy, poetry, novels by authors she'd always meant to read but had never found time for. In all the traditional stories, the princess gets rescued and lives happily ever after. But what if the real story isn't about being rescued? What if it's about choosing your own adventure, even if it looks completely insane from the outside? That's a beautiful theory, Ezra said carefully. But I'm still not sure what it has to do with a man in a cage. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into the backpack and pulled out the wildflowers she'd picked along the trail, lupin and Indian paintbrush and delicate mountain daisies that had somehow survived the 5-mile hike. They weren't the perfect roses from her original bouquet, but they smelled like the mountain air and sunshine, like possibility and choice. Will you marry me? She asked, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her nerve. I know it sounds completely crazy. I know you don't know me and I don't know you, but I think that might be exactly the point. I need to do something that's entirely my choice, something that nobody else would understand or approve of. I need to know I'm capable of writing my own story instead of just accepting the one other people have written for me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was probably only seconds. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the mountain peaks. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of the creek where beavers were building their own version of home, following instincts that made sense to them even if the rest of the world couldn't understand the logic. Ezra stood up slowly, moving to the iron bars that separated them. Up close, Sarah could see that his eyes weren't just gray but held flecks of blue and green, like a mountain lake under changing skies. There were lines around those eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, and she found herself wondering what stories had led him to build this beautiful prison for himself. You want to marry a man you've never met, who lives in a cage in the mountains, as an act of rebellion against a life you don't want, he said, his voice careful and measured. Have I got that right? When you put it like that, it sounds completely insane. Most of the best decisions do. He studied her face for another long moment. But marriage isn't a game, even when it's an act of rebellion. It's a promise between two people, and promises matter, even crazy ones. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, suddenly, aware of how her impulse must sound to him. You're right. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I've just been running from one mistake, and I'm about to make an even bigger one. I didn't say I wouldn't do it. She looked up at him sharply, certain she'd misheard. I said promises matter, Ezra continued. But that doesn't mean they can't be unconventional. You want to know if you're capable of making your own choices, of writing your own story. I've been wondering for 15 years if I'm capable of letting someone else into mine. Why do you live in there? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the cage. Same reason you climbed a mountain in a wedding dress, I suspect. Because sometimes the only way to be free is to choose your own prison. He moved to a section of the cage where there was a door, secured with a simple latch on the inside. I built this place after I lost everything that mattered to me. Lost it through my own choices, my own failures. This cage reminds me that I have the power to lock myself away from the world, but also that I have the power to let people in when I choose to. He opened the latch and pushed the door open, stepping out into the clearing for the first time since Sarah had arrived. She noticed that his movements were careful, deliberate, like someone who had grown used to the confines of small spaces. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we should probably know each other's names, at least. Sarah Mitchell. Though I guess after today it might be Sarah something else entirely. Ezra Stone. And, yes, that's really my name, not something I made up for dramatic effect." He looked at the wildflowers in her hands, then up at her face. "Sarah Mitchell, if I marry you today, what happens tomorrow? Do you go back to your old life? Do you stay here in the mountains? Do we pretend this never happened?" It was a fair question, and one Sarah realized she hadn't fully considered. She'd been so focused on escaping the wedding, on making a choice that was entirely her own, that she hadn't thought through the practical implications of what she was asking. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have a plan beyond this moment. All I know is that I need to do something that proves to myself that I'm capable of making real choices, not just going along with what everyone else expects. That's honest, at least." Ezra walked a few steps away from the cage, stretching his arms as if remembering what it felt like to move freely in open space. "Most people who find their way up here are running from something. But you're running toward something, aren't you? I think I'm running toward myself. The version of me that got lost somewhere along the way." Sarah looked down at her dress, noting how it had transformed during the hike from a symbol of traditional expectations into something entirely different, battle-worn, practical, marked by her own choices and effort. "I used to dream about adventures, about traveling and writing and building something meaningful with my own hands. Somewhere along the way, those dreams got replaced by other people's plans for my life. And you think marrying a stranger will help you find those dreams again? I think making a choice that's completely my own, consequences be damned, might remind me that I have the power to shape my own life." She met his eyes directly. "What about you? Why would you consider marrying someone you just met?" Ezra was quiet for a long time, looking out toward the mountain peaks that surrounded them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I told you I lost everything that mattered to me. I had a wife once, a woman I loved more than I thought it was possible to love another person. She died in a car accident that I caused, not intentionally, but through carelessness, through taking our life together for granted. I've spent 15 years believing that I didn't deserve another chance at love, at connection, at being part of someone else's story." Sarah felt her heart constrict with sympathy and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of the kind of pain that changes everything about how a person sees the world. "But maybe," Ezra continued, "the universe has a sense of humor. Maybe it sent me a runaway bride in a torn wedding dress to remind me that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in the most unexpected ways. That sometimes choosing to be vulnerable, to take a risk on another person, is the most courageous thing you can do." He turned back to face her, and Sarah saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Hope, tentative but real. "If we do this," he said, "it won't be a traditional marriage. I don't know how to be a traditional husband, and you're clearly not looking for a traditional wife role. But maybe we can figure out something that works for both of us, something that helps us both become more ourselves rather than less." Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally finding someone who understood that sometimes the most logical thing to do is something that looks completely illogical from the outside. "How would we even do it?" she asked practically. "I don't think there are any ministers up here, and I'm pretty sure you need licenses and witnesses and all sorts of official things." Ezra smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "Well, as it happens, I used to be a minister myself before I came up here. And while I can't legally marry us without the proper paperwork, I think we could create our own ceremony, make our own promises. The legal part we could figure out later, if we decided we wanted to."